I'm going to change gears and talk about the new hydrogen policy. Ashish Bhandari, Managing Director and CEO of Thermax Group, and along with him, Sumant Sinha, Chairman and CEO of Renew Power, they both join us. Mr. Sinha, Mr. Bhandari, good morning. Thank you for joining us. Mr. Sinha, the hydrogen policy. Good statement, important that India migrates to a new clean source of fuel. But what is the difference between intention and actual implementation? What are the bottlenecks? What are the challenges? And how effective do you think this policy will be?
Thank you so much for having me on the show. Well, look, that's a ton of questions that you asked me in that one question of yours. Look, I think that green hydrogen is an absolute essential requirement for India as a country. The reason being that India imports a tremendous amount of fossil fuels, as we all know, almost $150 billion every year. And that number is increasing and will double over the next 7 to 10 years. Green hydrogen is a way for India to find some degree of independency from fossil fuels by replacing a lot of the grey hydrogen, which, the feedstock of which is very often LNG, and essentially replace that with hydrogen that we can make within the country using renewable energy. So I think it's a very important method for us to wean our dependence on imports. Now, the second part of your question was, what is the gap between implementation and the policy? Look, I think it's very important that we get the right policies both on the demand side and the supply side. I think the policy that came out yesterday was more focused on the supply side, which is how to actually make the renewable energy part of it a little bit cheaper, how to store the green hydrogen or ammonia that is to be formed for exports. So I think it was really focused on those kinds of things, allowing the renewable energy to be produced in one part of India and shipped to another part of India through using the interstate transmission network, which I think is very critical. So all of those things are really focused on that part of the equation. I think from this point on, the government has to now start thinking about how to essentially encourage people to move towards using green hydrogen and really creating the demand side of the equation. So I think that is something that we still have to wait and see. But at least the supply side has been addressed to some extent, and that will hopefully allow the costs of producing green hydrogen to come down. And as that comes down and you create the demand side, over time, you will have the creation of a fairly large industry where India can also essentially become a net exporter of green hydrogen through the form of ammonia as well. So I think a lot of very positive things in this. First of all, the government's intent, which is very clear. The second, that they've moved to make some of these things possible. And now we need to see a lot of the other actions coming into place. And I think a few years from now, you'll probably see a very large green hydrogen / ammonia industry developing in the country.
Mr. Sinha, can you break it for our viewers that what have been the global parallels? Is green hydrogen more like still at a lab experiment stage, or commercially it is possible? And how far do you think we are behind the curve? Like EVs, the experimentation started almost a decade ago. We've in reality seen the first EV rollout about 2-3 years ago in India.
Yeah, look, I don't think that as far as green hydrogen is concerned that we are behind the curve at all. You know that India runs one of the largest renewable energy programs anywhere in the world, and renewable energy accounts for 70% of the cost of green hydrogen. So this is a new and emerging industry anywhere in the world at this point in time. Of course, the costs of green hydrogen are still higher than that people can get from using other sources of making hydrogen, which is really called grey hydrogen in a sense. And that's everywhere in the world. And so therefore, at this point, globally, people have not shifted to green hydrogen, but the visibility of cost reduction is there. Given the cost reduction that you've seen on the renewable energy side, it is likely to play out similarly in the manufacture of green hydrogen. And that will happen over the next, I would say, 4 to 5 years. Now, the question is, how do you actually get the cost down? You have to get the cost down by getting people to start adopting green hydrogen, creating the scale that is required, the technology and the ecosystem that is required to bring costs down. So it's a bit of chicken and egg. And I think what you have to do is you have to start creating green hydrogen mandates for people to start adopting some degree of green hydrogen. Using that, create the scale to bring down costs. So it's a little bit of, you have to really work on both ends of this to make the whole thing happen. And that is really what the government has started doing. But make no mistake, this is happening everywhere in the world right now at the same time. India is not behind the curve at all. In fact, India is in some ways taking the lead. And if you read the intent of the national policy that was announced yesterday, it essentially tries to make India in an exporter potentially of green hydrogen. And that is possible because A, we have really cheap renewable energy at this point in India. And two, because we are actually on the same part of the curve as anybody else is, and therefore we can actually use our country to provide a base for exports for green hydrogen and thereby leapfrog to some extent this whole industry. So I would say we are actually playing not catch up at all. We're actually trying to take leadership in this industry, which I think is a real positive.
Okay, so that's Sumant Sinha talking about how India can be in the leadership role when it comes to green hydrogen. Mr. Bhandari, if I can come to you, good morning. This is Nayantara. When it comes to green hydrogen, there is, of course, the entry cost as well, right? Yesterday, I was in conversation with a startup backed by Aadhar Poonawalla, who was saying the green hydrogen can sometimes cost 4x more than regular energy, fossil fuel energy. How big a problem is that going to be?
So, Nantara, first, very warm morning, good morning to your viewers, and thank you for having me on the show. The price differential that you have currently between what would be grey hydrogen, as someone call it, and green hydrogen is quite significant. And that price difference is driven both by the cost of generation of electricity, which is more than 50% of the cost of generating that green hydrogen, and that includes the cost of distribution and then the electrolysis part of it. What the government's trying to do is to address each part of that cost equation. The first, I think, on the electricity side, especially on the transmission side, the hydrogen announcement yesterday goes a long way in addressing some of the questions. Some of the state elements of what the state governments have authority and ability to do is still an open bit, but it's a step in the right direction. Next comes the electrolysis part, which is the other 30 to 50% of the cost, which the government expects to bring down by supporting manufacturing, giving tax breaks, coming up with PLI schemes so that the hardware and the equipment part of the green hydrogen generation part cost also comes down. Even after you do that, I think for the next 3 years, even longer possibly, there will be a viability gap between what grey hydrogen is at and what green hydrogen is at. And there the government will have to come in, support funding of some of the critical projects, get certain government PSUs, fertilizer companies, petrochemical companies to buy green hydrogen almost mandatorily, like you need to have 10% blending of green hydrogen or something of that sort that creates a demand side momentum as well, like Sumant was saying. So the supply part is being addressed. Now the demand part needs to get addressed and not look at whether you are at 100 rupees per kg today. Aim to get to that number 3 to 4 years from now, and knowing that between now and the next 3 years, you are in this global marketplace where you have to be competitive, looking to bring your cost curve down, not focusing on what the gap is today. But the gap's a real question. Yep, without government support, industry will have a tough time bridging the gap by themselves.
Mr. Sinha, if I can come to you for that point then, because you said this policy is also addressing more of the supply side issues. So with this differential, this arbitrage, that gap that exists, Mr. Bhandari is saying the best way is with government support. What are your views?
Is that question for me?
Yes, Mr. Sinha.
Sorry, could you repeat the question if you don't mind, Nanta?
Yeah, sure. I was saying Mr. Bhandari is talking about this arbitrage, the gap that exists in the price differential will have to have been addressed by the government incentives, government policy. You've talked about the new hydrogen policy being more supply side driven. How, in your view, can this arbitrage be addressed to make sure the demand exists?
Yeah, so look, that's the other part that we're waiting for. So I think one of the things that the government could look at doing essentially is that just like you have a renewable purchase obligation target for consumers of power, which actually requires them to have a certain minimum amount of renewable energy in their overall power basket. Similarly, for consumers of hydrogen, green hydrogen right now, you can specify that they have to have a minimum amount of green hydrogen, and that percentage can keep increasing over time. Now, that would what that would do is essentially create demand for green hydrogen, which then, from with all the supply side interventions, could be possibly supplied. Now, obviously, in the beginning, the cost of green hydrogen will be higher, but it will come down over time and come down quite rapidly. So I think green hydrogen purchase obligation targets are one simple way of providing demand that is required. Now, the question is on whom should this be applicable? It would be applicable on refineries which use a lot of green hydrogen, on fertilizer companies that use ammonia as a feedstock, and that ammonia essentially can be made from green hydrogen rather than grey hydrogen. Eventually, it can be used also by, or it can be also be applicable on users of LNG, and you can actually replace LNG as a feedstock as well by green hydrogen. So there are multiple industries where you can actually mandate that a certain amount of their consumption, which is currently coming in from grey hydrogen or LNG, can essentially be replaced by green hydrogen and thereby create demand. Now, the demand in India right now, the consumption in India right now of grey hydrogen is about 6 million tons, and that is expected to grow to double of this in the next 8 to 10 years. Now, so you can initially say that, look, please replace 5% or 10% of the total amount of grey hydrogen with green over the next 3 to 5 years, right? So that will create the demand side. You have the supply side interventions already happening, and therefore you start bridging the gap that Ashish talked about slowly and but steadily. And the expectation is that 4 to 5 years from now, that gap would have come down to almost nothing, and then it won't be, you won't require mandates any longer because everybody would really naturally gravitate towards green hydrogen rather than grey hydrogen. So I think that's the way you have to really go about doing this.
Now, Mr. Sinha, I've had the opportunity of interviewing you as well as L&T together on your green hydrogen plans, and we played that interview on ET now. So the next question will be for Thermax and Mr. Bhandari. You tell us, Mr. Bhandari, what is Thermax's plans when it comes to green hydrogen, and would yesterday's policy be good enough for companies like yours to maybe step on the gas?
We definitely intend to step on the gas. I think green hydrogen for the nation and for addressing climate change is a certainty. So it's not a question of if it will happen, and it will happen in the short term, and the short is 1 to 3 years period. We will see a big transition. So for most players that are in the energy space, we have to think about what that means. And we are taking that very, very seriously. Specifically to the policy, I think as Sumant said, yeah, let's look at this as one of multiple parts that will come out to the policy. Now that the central governments come up with an electricity policy, we'll have to see how the state governments look at it. Next, we will have to see how the demand side, which is what does MOPNG come up with, what incentives does PLI come up with. So let's see how the rest of the ecosystem develops, and what purchase obligations the steel ministry comes up with. And so we will see a lot of announcements in the coming months that all connect to building a hydrogen economy in India. Yeah, so let's look at this as one of many things that happen. For companies like Thermax, there are multiple roles that we can play. Yeah, first is just the entire execution and capability of designing a project around green hydrogen, the ability to bring electricity into play, but more designing the project from electrolyzer, the power management, all the software around it, the application, how does something get blended, what can get blended, how much can it get blended, bringing the science around it, and to be able to set up an entire project, yes, from an EPC perspective. That's something that Thermax is building capability for. Next, which is the whole electrolyzer question. Many companies in India will now look at, okay, how do I set up electrolyzer capability? What portion of it I can leverage our own capabilities for, what portion comes from global partnerships that companies will now look at. And many, including Renew, is doing that already. Many others, including Thermax, are looking at all of those options. This is very, very important, and at the heart of every strategy that Thermax is looking at going forward as well.
Okay, so let's see how all of those plans progress. Renew Power, of course, has entered into a joint venture with L&T as far as green hydrogen goes. Rest of India Inc. We've heard noises from Reliance Industries as well as the Adani Group, which has already set up a company for the same. I'd like to thank both Mr. Sinha as well as Mr. Bhandari for being live with us today on the market to help us understand green hydrogen. Green hydrogen, which is produced either from water electrolysis or from biomass, considered to be more sustainable but also far more expensive. But the government's come out with a policy to incentivize the production and use of green hydrogen. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a short commercial break. Stay with us. We'll be back in a couple of minutes. We've got a lot more lined up for you on the show, from Chartbusters, stock-specific trading ideas, and we're going to get to the FinTech Grow co-founder right here on the channel. It's the first interview since Satya Nadella made an investment. Stay tuned.